Political cover-ups will be exposed in less than 30 days. Martin North, John Adams, in the interests of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you going?
Doing well. We are recording it is Sunday evening on the 4th of June, and what a topic, Martin, because it was only a few hours ago that Channel 7 ran the special on Bruce Lehman's account of what happened in Parliament, and there was a number of very shocking things. So we're going to talk about political cover-ups and corruption and all those sort of topics, because I think it's particularly in the case of the course of the last few years, particularly with pandemic management, confidence in public officials and public policy has collapsed for a large number of citizens. And there is a big set of events happening in July, which I think it's worth calling out. And that is the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. And they open their doors on the 1st of July. And there's a number of important milestones that are going to happen in July, which I think, in my view, will dramatically alter the political system. And given that this is the interest of the people, and the people need honest government and honest officials, it's worth getting into the detail, because I think not many people are aware of some of the key dates coming up. And not only would I say ordinary people, in the past week I had some conversations with members of the Canberra Press Gallery, and I said, "Did you know the significance of the 20th of July?" And they said, "No, I don't." So when I explained it, they said it's very interesting. So here we are talking all about anti-corruption measures and obviously the exposure of political cover-ups wherever they may exist.
Yep, and I suspect that it's pretty endemic, all the cover-ups and all of the half-truths being told. So the question will be whether the NACC will really have sufficient teeth to make a difference, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yes. Canberra has a way of doing things that has yet to be fully exposed. And now that we have a National Anti-Corruption Commission, they will have full powers to do all sorts of things that have previously never been done before in the federal government, seizing records and phones and using listing taps on politicians to find out what's really going on. One of the things I recently did, Martin, this was about 6 weeks ago, I had a lengthy conversation with a former member for Dawson, George Christensen, and we had a good conversation about his career. And he was in Parliament for 12 years. And there was 2 occasions during the course of the coalition's time in power where he really went up against the government he went against his prime minister. One was his support for the Banking Royal Commission, and the second one was COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccines. And he actually gave a detailed account of what happens in those moments when you challenge the ruling elite, and how do they try to put you back in your box. And his view was that the Australian system was moving closer to a house of cards, Machiavellian sort of system, where all sorts of the rule of law and ethics and parliamentary standards is going to go out the window, and we're going to have a culture where people will just do anything and everything to win. And that's obviously, we can look at the US system and just see how corrosive that whole system is. So hopefully this NACC is going to expose some of the dark arts of Canberra, and we can actually start to get some of the bad apples out of the system. And dare I say, I think there's bad apples not only in Parliament, but also in the bureaucracy, as well as in the media. And one of the interesting things about the establishment of this commission is that it's not that they're not only just investigating corruption in terms of politicians or bureaucrats, it's those people outside of the public service or the political system who seeks to illegally influence politicians or bureaucrats. So, the way the legislation is crafted, and we'll get into this in a second, it casts a wide net, and so there's a lot of jurisdiction. So a lot of both jurisdiction and discretion that the commission has to pursue a whole host of in terms of potential people.
Yeah, there was a book recently out called Game of Mates. You may well have read it, which highlighted some of the undercurrents and some of the influencing processes that are endemic in it, sort of in and around the corporate and political system in Australia. And what it means is that whilst there are rules and guide rails for some people, other people seem to be able to go around them and through them and under them in their own interests. And the way that the system works is that it's the game of mates that wins out rather than the interests of the people. So I think this is a really important development in terms of exposing some of these things. So I could imagine there could be quite a string of referrals and potential referrals. I guess the question will be, how many will there be? How deep will they go? And will they really get to expose some of the inner workings that you, John, know and I know actually go on day in, day out?
Yes, yes. The one thing I'll call out, Martin, is that we've already seen an early indication from the in terms of the Royal Commission on Robo debts. The commissioner has who's a former Supreme Court judge, has basically said that she intends to make a number of referrals to the NACC, and that's why she wants to have an extension on her reporting timeframe. So there'll be a whole host of very interesting things coming out of that, but obviously because it's a new commission, we don't know exactly what is the threshold to trigger a corruption investigation, and then obviously when they do investigate, what level of quality will the investigation be, and obviously what will the outcome be at the conclusion of the investigation. So all to be seen, but I think there's just the two key dates just to call out is just before we get into the detail, Martin, is first one is 1st of July. That's when voluntary referrals can be made. And that means that people like you and me and our audience from the 1st of July can go to the National Anti-Corruption Commission and make a complaint about corruption. And now corruption is defined specifically in the law, and we'll get into that in a second. But the more, I think, important date is actually the 29th of July, because that's when the mandatory referrals kick in. And basically, under the legislation, if you are defined as an agency head, you have a mandatory legal obligation to report suspected serious or systemic corruption. So it's no longer an option. So you can't have the cone of silence. You can't look the other way. You are legally required to dob on the political forces that may be corrupt. And that's going to be a very interesting aspect to see, when people are legally forced to dob on other people inside the system, how the system will actually change and evolve. Because I think the whole culture inside Parliament House has gone to change from the 29th of July onwards.
And of course, Scott Morrison and some of the others on the Conservative side were very, very worried about this particular model of referral and investigation, and tried to weaken and undermine the whole idea of having a federal equivalent of some of the state entities. But ultimately, it did, come into form in a way that, well, it does have some teeth, doesn't it? So it certainly would potentially change the game. The question is, how long will it take? How far will it go? And I guess that's down to how many referrals they get, both, as you say, through the informal channel where people can make referrals, but also through the more formal channel where people have no obligation but to report it if they see it.
Exactly. So yes. So just by way of context, Martin, the legislation, so the National Anti-Corruption Commission Act 2022 was passed both houses of Parliament on the 30th of November. It came into royal assent on the 12th of December. And so they spent 6 months getting the commission set up and all the hiring of the staff and the operational procedures and all the backend systems that are required. And so if anyone's interested, there's a lot of very good information on the Attorney General's website that has already been posted up there, and that's where I've been crawling through a lot of this detail to understand. Given our provocative show about the final secret, exposing the Australian Prime Minister, I'm now considering what my next set of options are, and the National Anti-Corruption Commission is potentially an option that I may potentially pursue, depending on events that may occur in the next 5 weeks. But But Martin, the Attorney General's Department website has a very good video which goes for about 2 minutes that actually explains what the commission is and how it will function. So I thought it'd be worthwhile just to play it for our audience because I don't think anyone would have seen it by now.
Okay, let's watch it.
Corruption has no place in the Australian public sector. When our integrity falters, we begin to lose the public's trust. And without the trust and support of the community, our ability to serve the government, the Parliament and the Australian public is diminished. That's why on the 30th of November 2022, the Australian Parliament passed legislation to keep the Commonwealth public sector free of serious and systemic corruption through the establishment of a transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission, also known as the NACC. As part of a broader federal integrity framework, the NACC is an agency with a dedicated focus on detecting and investigating serious or systemic corruption. So who can the NACC investigate? The short answer is public officials and those who might try to corrupt them. It's a broad jurisdiction that can include anyone from government agency employees and contracted service providers, all the way to Commonwealth ministers, parliamentarians and their staff. And in certain circumstances, the NACC can even investigate people who aren't public officials. There are 4 types of serious or systemic corruption that the NACC can investigate: a breach of public trust, an abuse of office, misuse of information, or anything that could adversely affect a public official's honesty or impartiality in their official capacity. We all have a role to play in upholding integrity in the Commonwealth public sector. Remember, anyone can report corrupt conduct, including corruption that occurred before the establishment of the NACC. It's also important to know that when you report corruption to the Commission, you will be protected, including protection from civil, criminal or administrative liability, such as disciplinary action. Detailed information about how to make a report will become available through the Commission. So let's safeguard integrity in our public sector and uphold the trust Australians have placed in us. Learn more about the National Anti-Corruption Commission on the Attorney General's Department website at ag.gov.au/integrity.
Yeah, well, that's very clear, and it really does underscore what we've been saying. This is a very important change in the weather.
Indeed. Now, Martin, I thought now that we've watched the video and it gives a bit of an explanation about what the NACC is and how it will be, I thought we would just go through the definitions of corruption. So the corruption definitions in the Act is Section 8. There are 4 specific acts that if a public official or politician does, then it is corruption. One of the things that it was clear to me when I first read the legislation is that an official or a politician has to do something that is they have to have actually done an act in order to be corrupt. One of the things that the legislation doesn't say, and I was kind of disappointed about this, is if a public official or a politician doesn't do something, well, then in many instances that is not corrupt. So for example, if a politician or a public official doesn't speak out about a particular sensitive political matter, one could say that they didn't act in the public interest by speaking out the truth of whatever that matter may be. And obviously there was a whole host of contentious issues during COVID-19, and the fact that people kept on towing the line, some people view that as corruption by not actually addressing the pressing issues of the day with the best scientific evidence available. So the act of not, in the instance of not act or not speaking publicly, that is not corruption. It is that a politician has to have done something specific. And if you are going to go to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, you have to basically say that on this date, this specific individual did this specific thing, and that specific act is corrupt under the 4 definitions of corruption. And that's the type of complaint that one must construct. I mean, one thing I'll say is only in the last 12 hours I've had a conversation from someone who's thinking of making a referral to the NACC on a particular issue. And as we were going through what they thought was corruption. I said, well, what you're describing isn't actually defined in the legislation as corruption. So that's why it's very clear to understand the following definitions, and then obviously trying to put together a series of facts that comport with these definitions. So if we go on to slide 2, Martin, so section 8 of the legislation, it says, quote, any conduct of a person, whether or not a public official, that adversely affects or that could adversely affect either directly or indirectly the honest or impartial exercise of any public official's powers or as a public official, or the honest or impartial performance of any public official's functions or duties as a public official. So basically, anything that one may do that would, for example, as we said in the final secret, the Prime Minister is potentially sending a signal to Asic investigators. You can't do anything that would directly or indirectly make someone not perform their proper functions, and in doing that could be seen as corrupt. Now, there's a couple of quick things I will call out, Martin, is that if someone does something that impacts the efficiency of someone's performance, that is not corruption. And then the other thing that the legislation says is that if someone does, if a public official is influenced to do something in a private capacity, that is not corruption. So you've got to be able to clearly say that someone in their public role was adversely influenced or impacted to meet the definition of 8A. And if someone, for example, is doing their job slowly, and you could say that they're doing their job slowly because they've been adversely influenced by a politician, that the mere act of not doing things efficiently is not corruption according to the legislation.
So it does actually draw a few rings around some of the things that you and I suspect goes on. People deliberately slowing down, or indeed people not doing the things they should be doing, and neither of those would actually be necessarily caught.
Yeah, Martin, the legislation is very clear as to what is in terms of an abuse of office. And so some of the games of yes minister and yes prime minister can still continue even under the current regime. So one could say that Sir Humphrey instructing his department not to adhere to the instructions of the minister because it goes against the interests of the public service in Whitehall. That those types of tactics by Sir Humphrey are still permissible, and they are not correct.
Yes. I suppose, on the other hand, you could argue that they're trying to see positive evidence of corrupt behaviour, and therefore trying to prove a negative would be quite difficult.
Indeed. Now, Martin, if we go on to the next slide, so if we're looking at definition 8B, it says, quote, any conduct of a public official that constitutes or involves a breach of public trust. And the breach of public trust is basically to say that while you have a public role, you have certain powers and certain obligations and duties, and you must act in accordance with those powers and duties. And if you do something beyond what is intended, well, that is a breach of the public trust. So that's the second definition of corruption. When we look at 8C, quote, any conduct of a public official that constitutes, involves, or is engaged in for the purpose of abuse of the person's office as a public official. And then definition D is any conduct of a public official or former public official that constitutes or involves the misuse of information or documents acquired in the person's capacity as a public official. And obviously, Martin, in the case of in terms of 8D, the last week has been fully consumed in Canberra with PwC. So the only thing I'll say on PwC was that Mr. Collins was a private citizen misusing government information, and I mean, there are provisions in the criminal code around dishonesty. So I think it's section 135.1 of the criminal code is dealing with the conduct of Mr. Collins. But if you're a public official and you misuse government information for a nefarious purpose, that is covered by, in terms of definition 8D. So these are the 4 specific definitions that the legislation has. And Martin, you and I have been doing a number of shows over the last 4 or 5 years where we can see clearly in the comments on YouTube, a number of people have said this person's corrupt or that person's corrupt, or I don't trust Canberra, I don't trust the system, and this person's working for this person. So with all those people who watch our program and who are frustrated with the direction of the country and how certain people behave, people will have to come up with specific instances and try to match it against one of these 4 definitions if they are to get the NACC interested in a formal corruption investigation.
Absolutely. Yes, you have to understand within the guidelines and guide rails as articulated in this legislation how to identify and progress. Otherwise, you won't get far at all.
Indeed. So just quickly, I'll touch on, just to go back to the this issue of mandatory referral. So if we go on to the next slide, this comes again from the Attorney General's website. It says, quote, "The heads of Commonwealth agencies and parliamentarians have obligations under the National Anti-Corruption Commission Act 2022. They must refer certain issues to the NACC for potential investigation." Now the reason why I think this is significant is, having been in political circles for 20 years, there is enormous pressure in the major parties to keep your mouth shut, particularly if there is information which is politically damaging. And I over the last 20 years, I've known of specific instances of corruption, not in terms of public officials, but people within, say, the Liberal Party who had acted in a manner that was corrupt. And when the journalists start trying to get people to go on camera, people have been threatened to say, well, your career in the Liberal Party would be finished if you go on national TV and you say something, and that would be adverse to the interests of the party. So this whole cone of silence, it is ingrained, and it's been happening for decades, both in the coalition as well as the Labor Party. And so now we have a obligation that politicians have no choice but to make a referral. And the one thing I'll only say about the Asic inquiry is that there are a number of case studies which point to either incompetence, public malfeasance, or even potentially corruption in terms of how Asic has behaved in certain instances. And I know that there are a number of people looking at this legislation and looking at specific case studies to be able to see whether some sort of case can be made. The only thing I can also say is, Martin, is that there is, I've had a lot of information come across my desk about Asic over the last 6 months. Some of it we've discussed, some of it, a lot of it I haven't discussed. But once you start to get a feel for the true nature of this agency, it's more disturbing than one can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing there is that once again, that the sort of the guidelines are sort of there, but you can still see evidence potentially going around the edges. And so this is not a 0-100 solution, is it? It's perhaps moving towards a solution vis-a-vis corruption, but it's definitely not the be-all and end-all. Yes.
And Martin, if we just go on to the next slide, I'll just quickly go through this again. It says, a quote, "After 28 July, agency heads must start to make mandatory referrals of anything that they become aware of from 1 July 2023 onwards. They still voluntarily refer a corruption issue to the NACC within the first 28 days. So the thing is, but also there's a paragraph on the website that talks about historical conduct as well. So basically, the floodgates will open from the 1st of July, and there'll be a whole host of voluntary referrals. No doubt they'll be made by all sorts of people. But from the 29th of July, after the first 28 days, that's when there'll be a mandatory obligation. And in the context of the Asic inquiry, if the inquiry becomes convinced that there is something that meets the definition of corruption, well, they have no choice but to make a mandatory referral. So given that the inquiry has sort of dragged out, playing out during the course of the second half of 2023, there could be some very interesting dynamics which were perhaps not foreseen when we were able to get the inquiry established in October last year.
I wonder what there is in the legislation relating to the reporting of referrals. For example, will they have to say how many were made, how many were actually pursued, how many were dismissed?
Well, I don't like. Very interesting. You should say that. I don't think there's any specific anything in the law about performance statistics or the processing of complaints. And obviously, the whole basis of our Asic inquiry was my ability to take Asic's own numbers and to put them in an Excel spreadsheet and come up with a number of graphs and show that their performance is bad. So, dare I say, there'll be some sort of annual report that the NACC will produce for Parliament to observe. But I think the nature and the form of that reporting is still yet to be determined. So in conclusion, Martin, there's obviously a lot of things happening across the country, and while there are people focusing on economic things and other things, I really do think that in terms of at least the domestic political scene, July is going to be a very monumental and seminal month in the nature of the political system. My expectation is that this NACC will have, at least in the short term, it's going to have a dramatic impact on the political culture within Canberra. I do expect a number of high-profile investigations, some of them stemming from the Morrison government era, and there was a number of scandals related to the Morrison government era about certain grants, certain commercial transactions, like the land at Badger's Creek. That was purchased multiple times more than what the land was worth, and then you've obviously had some of these other scandals, whether it's the Higgins case or the Rochelle Miller case and a few other things like that. So it'll be very interesting to see how all of that plays out, and I think that there's a lot of sweeping up the Commission has to do to ensure that those people who had acted corruptly before the last election held to account. But obviously we have a number of ongoing live matters, including the one that we've been discussing here on this show, that will be, it'll be very interesting to see how all this plays out. And one of the things that I'll just say again, Martin, is that as I've been talking to some of my political contacts, some of them are not necessarily alive to all the ramifications to what this NACC is going to do, but dare I say that look, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised. So now, some people may be skeptical, and some people may say that it won't really move the needle, but that'll be the challenge for the Commission. But I have no doubt, Martin, that some of our listeners feel like that the federal system is corrupt. And there's been instances of corruption around certain policy matters or certain decisions or certain scandals. So from the 1st of July, our listeners, you, Martin, me, anyone can go to the Commission and ask for a corruption investigation. And that's going to be a very interesting process to go through. And obviously, if one does make a complaint, it'll be interesting to see how the Commission processes that complaint and where that information goes. The only thing I would say on that, Martin, is that a lot of the staff that have been hired, the NACC, have come from the New South Wales ICAC system. So if anyone is thinking about making a referral, if you can find anyone that has experience in the New South Wales system, maybe they'll give you a bit of a sense as to what type of complaint and the form and the level of evidence that's required to get this new body activated in terms of investigation. But otherwise, it's less than 30 days, and I think hopefully those that have been acting against the public interest will start to be sweating, and maybe we'll see some, if we're lucky, some premature resignations ahead of anything that could trigger something serious in the legal system.
Well, so John, it's good you've been spotlighting this, because this is a small step in the right direction, indeed, in the interest of the people.
Exactly.
Thanks, John. Talk to you soon. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.